Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second panel of today's conference. My name is Marcin Terlikowski. I'm Deputy Head of Research Office at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And I have to say, it's an utmost pleasure for me to be here today at RAND HQ in Arlington to take part in this joint PISM-RAND conference, the first of its kind, but I hope definitely not the last one. And to talk about the issue which is perhaps now equally important and tightly linked to what we discussed in the previous panel, the issue of the Russian reconstitution, the reconstitution of Russian military capacity, and the issue of the upcoming future threat from this Russian military capacity to Ukraine, NATO, and to peace in Europe. How it may look like, what are the lessons learned which Russia is taking from the battlefield in Ukraine? How could Russian military devise new ways of threatening NATO, of threatening peace in Europe, of advancing its operations in Ukraine? And to answer these questions, I have a stellar lineup today. And let me briefly introduce panelists, starting perhaps with our virtual guest from Warsaw, Deputy Director Anna Tyszkiewicz. She's a career diplomat in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, focusing on international security, on NATO, and a long-term friend of PISM, so we work very often together. So welcome, and thanks for finding time to join us, even if virtually. Then going from left to right, perhaps Kęstutis Paulauskas, representing NATO Allied Command Transformation, but again, a friend of PISM. I think we've known each other for a decade or more, focusing on everything NATO, Eastern Flank, defense and deterrence. Krystyna Marcinek, last moment line added to the panel, Policy for Research Associate at RAND, focusing on Russian Constitution. And definitely, last but definitely not least, my colleague from PISM, Anna Maria Diner, who is also focusing in her research on Russian and Belarusian military capacities and the Russian military cooperation. So, starting straight with business, I would like to go to you, Anna. Basing on your recent work on Russian reconstitution, how can you tell us how is Russia learning? What kind of lessons is Russia taking from Ukraine, and how is it reconstituting its force? What is the likely outcome of the processes which we all have seen, the processes of improving the system of mobilization, of repairing the equipment damaged in Ukraine, of also innovating in the battlefield with very often dual-use technologies? How is this process going, and where it may lead to in terms of the Russian, if you wish, posture in the next 1-2 years? We've had 2024, 2025 could be crucial years. What kind of Russian military threat can we expect in the future, close future?
Thank you, Marcin, for this question. I will start with one issue which may be obvious for all of us, but it's extremely important because in the case of Ukrainian war, the main issue is political will on both sides. I mean, in Russia and Ukraine/Western countries. So first of all, I should stress that the main aim of Putin's next term is just to achieve goals of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, which means that the Russian authority want to integrate the occupied territories of Ukraine, and definitely they want to change the Ukrainian authorities and to change the policy of Ukraine and force Ukraine to withdraw with the plan of Euro-Atlantic integration, I mean, with both with the EU and NATO. So that's why, from the Russian perspective, this war is so important. We also have to take into account that from the Russian perspective, the war in Ukraine to some extent is defensive one. It may sound strange, however, still it also changed the policy of the state, which will probably seriously influence, if they will happen, of course, the future negotiations. Starting that, we can see that Russia learned a lot from the first year of this war. They started to rebuild its own capacities. They invest a lot in new training centers. Nowadays, they are able monthly to train like 35,000 of troops, which means that it's 10,000, how to say, surplus to some extent over the irrecoverable lessons losses in Ukraine. Moreover, the military facilities are working 24 hours per 7 days. They are also able to repair the equipment needed on the Ukraine front line. What also Shoigu mentioned, and maybe also important, that during this year, Russia wants to build two new armies, combined armies, the same story like in 2023. And they also want to build 14 divisions and 16 new brigades. Some of them will be located in Leningrad's military district, because we also have to notice that from the very end of February, there is no Western military district anymore. It was split into two, into Moscow's and Leningrad's one. Leningrad's will be, how to say, to some extent responsible for NATO direction. And we can see that nowadays Russia is building there on the Kola Peninsula and Kaliningrad Oblast 3 army corps, 2 close to borders with Finland, and 1 in Kaliningrad Oblast. What is also very important, nowadays Russia spends 30 up to 40% of its budget on the military purposes. This is more than 6% of the GDP, the highest rate in the history. So it shows that Russia will be extremely concentrated during next 3 years to achieve these goals in Ukraine. If we will be able to help Ukraine on the level that Ukraine may be ready to survive during these 3 years, the situation may start to look better for us, worse for Russia, because of financial situation and because of the end of equipment of the storages, even this with the long from the past the Soviet times. What is also very important from our perspective, it's that one another goal of Russia is also to interfere the alliance NATO approach to the future security architecture in Europe. Definitely, Russia will want to accept their own visions, which were presented in December 2021, but also to accept the new state of Ukraine, which also will be created in Kremlin, not somewhere else. So that's why in the next future, we can expect information warfare, we can expect cyber attacks, and we can expect interference in critical infrastructure in NATO countries, especially in Eastern flank, but also here in the US, especially information warfare connected with upcoming presidential elections. Definitely, Russia won't resign from its own aims, because if there will be a feeling that they lost in Ukraine, they will change the whole situation within Russia, but also broadly in the whole post-Soviet space, and probably also in some other fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So from what you just said, it seems to me that we could face a Russia which is better at numbers. You mentioned the 16 divisions, better organized on its Western strategic direction because of because of the split of the former military district into two, and at the same time, Russian military which combines mass with some innovations and with hybrid. So this would be quite a different, I would say, mix of capabilities, quite a different posture which we used to, let's say, analyze prior to February 24th, 2022, when and the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. How this kind of posture, how this kind of Russian capacity, this mix could change our thinking about Russian ways and methods of escalation against NATO. And with this question, I'd like to go to you, Christina.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for opportunity to speak. Right to your question. So I would say that this is really interesting case because Russia is definitely reconstituting. It's learning a lot, but I would say that if we listen to what Russia is saying, you know, what the Minister Shoigu is saying, what President Putin are saying about this war and what needs to happen in the aftermath, it's really interesting because, you know, you could shortly characterize it as essentially actually more and better of the same, in a sense that there is very little thought put into, you know, on this official level of how the future war could look like and whether it would look differently to this one. And what I mean by that is that President Putin actually said that, you know, we have to be learning from this war, but the way he frames it, because he frames this war as essentially war against, well, in fact, against the West. So he's, you know, highlighting that Ukraine is using NATO capabilities. That in a way constrains the ability of even Russian thinkers to kind of have this discussion about how with NATO, whether war with NATO would look radically different, because they're saying we're essentially fighting NATO. It's Ukrainian soldiers, but NATO capabilities. And so there's, on that official level, there's actually little discussion, open and explicit discussion about how war with NATO could look differently. There is, however, discussion. Well, first of all, they are talking about things that needs improvement, which is already, you know, a rare case in Russia. So they're talking about, unsurprisingly, of course, they're talking about the importance of nuclear capabilities, of strategic forces, which, you know, they have not manifested themselves on the battlefield, but they have been manifesting themselves in signaling. So this is something, you know, they think is very important to deter NATO, because obviously, you know, from their perspective, they're you know, again, that's a defensive war and all that. So nuclear capabilities, command and control and communications, counter battery fires, and UAVs, and in general modern equipment. So if we listen to this, it's essentially just like more modern and more troops, like more and better, but ultimately of the same. There's very little discussion about, okay, maybe the whole force model was wrong. You know, they're standing up new divisions, new brigades, new armies. There's very little discussion about, well, maybe we need a new model on that official level. Then we do have a discussion among military experts, and this is, but there's very little agreement about it. It's very interesting when we read Russian military literature, that it goes literally from like old Soviet model. There are experts who say, you know, we made a strategic mistake by cutting down our troops. If we were fighting against NATO, we would need 1.5 to 3 million soldiers. And you know, and this group of experts talk about nuclear weapons, about mass in ground troops. You know, one expert said, you know, old tank is better than no tank. And so there's this recognition that, you know, they believe that the next war would be this ground warfare where Russia has a historical advantage. And then, you know, there are those that say, no, war with NATO would be predominantly, first, it would be really air campaign, striking critical infrastructure, striking C2 nodes, logistics, and only at the end ground troops would enter. And then all the way to kind of to the part of expert community that say, well, actually, because there's this problem of persistent ICR, there's a huge difficulty in massing troops. And so we should actually go not only to this dispersed warfare idea, which would be, you know, kind of BTGs on steroids, but also in a sense, it's dispersed also in terms of command and control. And what they essentially talk about is mission command, which I think would require a level of cultural change that they're not really, this is something that they keep talking about, the initiative among officer corps, that they should be taking more initiative, but I think just culturally it's very, very difficult. So this is kind of the spectrum. So what I'm trying to say is that they are observing this war, they're trying to learn some lessons, but because this is a very paradoxical war, which started with this, they attempted this maneuver warfare, they started with those very mobile troops at the very beginning that failed, and now it's essentially more or less a stalemate where, you know, you have mass, but then persistent ICR that makes it very difficult to move forward. They're just having this, you know, they're having honestly the same problem we have. I mean, they see the same paradoxes that we see, and you know, they're trying to think about how to move forward in the future. And one thing I would say, you know, also with reference to the previous panel. So, for example, one of the things they're talking about is mining and demining, and you know that goes back to the discussion about engineering and obstacles that are difficult for Ukraine. You know, they're, for example, thinking about using drones. So they talk a lot about drones and different ways of using or ground robotic capabilities. But, you know, this is kind of, there's a full spectrum of, you know, that it's very hard for them to decide because they understand certain constraints they have. But then also they see the challenges of modern battlefield. And I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Christina. I can see already that Anna would like to comment, but I will be back to you to react to what everyone would have said. So now, according to the schedule, we would turn to Warsaw with a question to you, Anna, on how this kind of reconstituted Russian capacity, which would be bigger and perhaps also in some technology capability areas better. How would it be seen, how it is already seen from Warsaw in terms of a potential threat to NATO, in terms of a potential escalation of tension with NATO, of course, which would be seen by Moscow as a way of pursuing its strategic goals, because we both in the first panel and here we already mentioned that the strategic goals of Moscow, of Russia, did not change, and the political rationale for creating a credible capacity, credible threat of escalation towards NATO would be strictly linked with this strategic goals of Russia. But how we're looking at it from the perspective of Warsaw? Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to join you from Warsaw. I'll try to contribute. I listened with interest to Anna and Christina, and I must say I agree with everything they said. Russia has really learned its lesson. It mobilized defense industry, as the panelists said. It undertook a serious modernization effort of its armed forces. And what is striking for us, it's the scale, but also it's the conceptual structure of the reconstruction. And that's something that Anna talked about. And that shows clearly that the goal of this effort, it's not just Ukraine. It's the West. And also, as Christina said, it's the West because for Russia, the war it's waging, it's the war with the West. It's not the war with Ukraine. And we are part of the bigger picture when we look at the aims of Russia, which is changing totally the security architecture in Europe. It was also already said that actually it's not something when we say it like a Polish phobia, but it's something that was clearly put on paper by the Russian side in December 2021, when Moscow actually clearly stated that it wants to reverse the changes that took place in Europe after 1997, that it aims to create a zone of influence, its own zone of influence in Central Europe, to push the US military presence out of Europe. And as we see in Ukraine, Russia is actually willing to use all the means it has at its disposal, including military ones. There's a discussion among many experts how much time we have. And I will dare to say that the actual threat we are facing is immediate. It's now. It's not a discussion when it will happen. Moscow already now regularly tests NATO's response by pushing the boundaries of what is permissible as far as possible. And for example, here in Poland, we face repeated and, as we judge them, very well calculated violations of the Polish airspace by Russian missiles that are heading to Ukraine. But from our perspective, it is a calculated escalation by the side of Russia. So what should we expect in the future? In the short term, a lot will depend on how the expected Russian spring-summer offensive will go. If Ukrainians don't manage to hold the lines, that would be a serious blow to Ukrainian leadership, but also to the leadership of the Western countries, which are so fiercely politically, but also practically supporting Ukraine. But in the medium to longer run, that means for us that actually the challenge from Russia will continue to grow. As it was said, Russia is fully prepared for a long-term confrontation with the West. Its society, economy, military, everything is at the stage of full mobilization. And the tactic that Russia is using, it's to create strategic dilemmas by setting ambiguous and constantly fluctuating red lines. And Russia is threatening escalation against the West, but in practice, currently, as long as it's engaged in Ukraine, it's actually avoiding direct confrontation with the West. Everything could change if Russia is successful in Ukraine. But what I would like to stress is that Russian readiness to escalate, it's not related in any way to what actually NATO is doing. What Russia does, it looks for vulnerabilities, for windows of opportunities, and it tries to use them to its advantage, which means that the crucial element is actually the Russian perception. If the West is perceived as weak, Russia will use the occasion to test our credibility. So what we have to concentrate on, it's to make sure that we don't send any mixed signals, and that we start a serious work on the long-term containment strategy of Russia. And that's one of the goals we would see for the NATO summit in Washington in July.
Thank you, Anna. And you precisely stop where I would like to take it from. So on the long-term character of the Russian threat challenge to peace and security in Europe, of the Russian threat, we're happy to have Kęstutis here representing ACT, which is precisely the command which deals with transformation, so with projecting the battlefield of the future for NATO soldiers. So tell us, please, how ACT looks at this reconstituted Russian threat. How much perhaps innovation you assume could come within Russian force? Would it be the type of the adversary for NATO as the Soviet Union was in the Cold War, or would it be a different one, perhaps more dangerous?
Thank you, Marcin. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Pleasure to be here. I have to start with a disclaimer. I do work for Allied Command Transformation, but my views are personal. If you want NATO position and policy, you can go on our website and you will find out our official policy and position. Marcin, I think this is the right question to ask, the long-term strategy, both on Russian side and on NATO side, which we sometimes forget because of the urgent, which is the current war and how we deal with it. But the important question is, what do we do in the long term? Because Russia is not going away. It is not going away in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years. There will still be a Russia of some kind going forward, and we need a strategy to deal with it. We also need to understand, when we look at Russia's longer term trajectory, we need to really understand the enduring elements. And I think we have touched some of that already, the enduring strategic goals. The goal number 1, regime survival, that is not going away. Goal number 2, they are related, of course, great power status under some sort of Yalta II arrangement where Russia gets to decide on Euro-Atlantic security architecture. No matter how the war in Ukraine ends, those 2 strategic goals are not going away. The only change that we can foresee is temporal aspect. In case Ukraine wins or in case Russia wins, that timeline of these 2 strategic goals can be expedited. The second enduring element is Russian theory of victory. The Russians have a pretty clear theory of victory that is by now, I think, better understood in the West also. The essential element of that is setting decisive conditions for victory in peacetime. Decisive conditions in peacetime so that Russia can achieve quick victory in conflict. How do they do that in peacetime? The key element of that is, of course, the new generation warfare, hybrid, reflexive control, getting into, and I think someone mentioned, into our decision-making cycle, into our perceptions. And nuclear threat is the best example of that, where we take Russian nuclear threat and turn it into our own conclusion that if we do something, they will escalate in nuclear domain. This is exactly what they want. This is exactly what the essence of reflexive control is. And when they are in conflict, it's all about escalation control, so through dosage of pain, the limited use of unlimited force, escalation control to achieve their goals in conflict. So these elements, this theory of victory is, again, unlikely to change regardless of how the conflict ends. And then the third part, the third enduring element is how they organize their armed forces. And I fully agree with my fellow panelists. The center of gravity for the Russian military is the ground force, the grand old service of Russian military. That is not going to change. Now, I like to, when we discuss Russian organization, I like to talk about the 5 M's. The manpower, this is core, and it's impressive how they can mobilize quickly. It's probably faster and better than any European nation can pull off. The numbers they could mobilize and continue to mobilize on a monthly basis. This is amazing. Missiles, this is not going away from the way they think. Long range, short range, medium range, all of the ranges, missiles and munitions. The third M is mobility. It's critical for them, but it's also potentially a critical vulnerability, moving across the vast spaces of Russia. Maneuver, it is still an essential element. Even when they fail, they continue to try again and again, and this is what we see in Ukrainian battlefields. Encirclement, 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 bridgeheads. This goes back to Soviet era, again, an enduring element in Russian military thinking. And then maskirovka. Deception at all levels, strategic, operational, tactical, getting very hard, especially at strategic level, but they continue to seek ways to improve it. Of course, a number of innovations are coming to the way they organize. It's impressive to see how fast they learn in the battlefield, how they were able to constrain, to shorten their reconnaissance strike OODA loop from almost an hour to now maybe 10 minutes, acquisition of a target and then striking the target. The crude innovation they're doing with the unguided dumb bombs, just putting wings on, and that's innovation. Very simple, very cheap, but it's effective. They are very inefficient, but they are very effective because of the way they approach conflict. So this way, again, going forward, we will see a lot of the old Soviet-style attritional type of warfare with the new generation warfare elements that work for them, reflexive control, cyber strike, informational space where they dominate. So that's Russia. If you flip quickly on the NATO side, you have to think, okay, so what are NATO strategic goals? I think we mentioned one, we will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. This is what you can find in our official policy and statements and declarations. But that includes, as long as it takes, it includes also Ukraine's defeat. We will stand as long, and then if Ukraine is defeated, this is it. If we accept that Ukraine's victory is critical for Euro-Atlantic security and Ukraine's defeat is really bad for Euro-Atlantic security, we need to start shifting towards anything it takes. Not as long as it takes, anything it takes for Ukraine to win. If we accept the premise, this is critical for Euro-Atlantic security. So we need that long-term strategy on how do we contain, constrain, contest Russia and what kind of Russia we want. Our own theory of victory, a very difficult and challenging issue. The core of it is, of course, deterrence and defense. And someone mentioned the defense of every inch of NATO's territory. And there are two problems with that. Space, cyber, information, and environment does not have inches. You cannot measure those domains in inches. And we do not have a good grasp of how do we win in those domains. And the second problem is deter and defend every inch. It leads directly to attritional warfare, the type of warfare where Russia excels. So what is our theory of victory? How do we think we can win beyond just deterring and defending? As Lukasz said in the beginning, how do we get ahead of the threat curve and shape that environment to our own advantages where NATO is really strong? That leads to the last part, how do we organize our force? And this is where, of course, we lead the work for NATO. What is our future force design? How we design the force that can be victorious in those future battlefields? In a way, NATO has also been reconstituting. Remember, we have been degrading our capabilities for 2 decades after the Cold War, cutting defense spending, cutting force structures, cutting entire families of capabilities. We only since around 2014, we started to reconstitute NATO, and we are still reconstituting. We are getting better, and General Kroll mentioned some of those elements. We have a new family of plans. We have a new force model. We are aspiring, I think Secretary General mentioned 300,000 high-end, heavier, high readiness forces that can fight in multiple domains and multiple regions. We are moving to that MDO-enabled, digitally transformed alliance. But the fundamental question remains, do we want a force that can defend every inch, which sort of leads to one way of organizing your force and one way of organizing your capabilities? Or do we want a force that can win and defeat the adversary, which points in the direction of long-range strike, cyber strike, cognitive warfare, these types of capabilities that would enable us to really win, not just not to lose. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Kęstutis. It's been very rich diagnosis of Russian reconstitution and prospective threat. You may feel a bit scared when listening to you and how your all voices chime together. But you touched upon already the part which our panel and the entire conference is also about. So the recommendations on what to do with it, what we as allies, what US, Poland, in cooperation with other allies in NATO, what we could do, how we could actually complicate the process of reconstitution, how we could prepare for the future. So I would like to take the second round of your interventions, in which I'd ask you maybe a bit shorter than previously, because we still would like to have some time for questions which are coming both from online audience. I guess there will be also questions from in-person audience. If you can reflect upon this and also perhaps comment on what you heard. I don't know who would like to go first in this. I'm looking also at Anna in Warsaw. Yes, please go ahead.
I will jump on the question you just asked. I will probably repeat what many of you have heard before, but what's key, and I'll go back to the question of perception. We need to keep the unity of the message and the unity of our resolve, and there has to be no questions about our engagement, and no question about any restrictions and self-imposed limits. We need to be clear about the goal. and we have to voice it to the world and to our adversary. The second element is sanctions. There's a lot of discussion about sanctions, but they are effective. Maybe they didn't manage to cripple totally the Russian war effort, but they are definitely a serious hurdle that Putin has to face. So we need to keep sanctions, but we also have to keep thinking creatively how to close the loopholes, how to make sure that the implementation of existing sanctions is better. That's something actually at the MFA we have engaged in quite actively to try to get all the internal institutions to communicate better with each other, exchange information, and to make sure that we manage to grasp any entities that are trying to use the loopholes. And the third element, I'll come back to NATO. Of course, there is a discussion will not give up any inch of the territory, and looking actually at how devastating is the war in Ukraine, I think we all agree about it, that we cannot imagine even 1 kilometer of our territory to be conquered by Russia, because we know what atrocities would happen. So what NATO needs to do on its side, on the defense and deterrence, it's to make sure that it delivers. We have taken a lot of decisions in NATO on reforms, on the new model of forces, on the new plans. But now we have to make sure that behind those plans, they are specific forces assigned. There is equipment that is ready to be used. That's something for the NATO Washington summit to concentrate on. We also need to make progress on the question of Ukraine. And one thing, it's the practical element. Everybody agrees we need to make sure that we manage to coordinate our efforts better, make sure they are long-term, they are sustainable. There is a discussion on to what extent NATO could actually be more involved in this effort, taking into account that NATO has an amazing structure which is capable of actually looking at this more strategic long-term planning. But we also have to reflect on where do we want to see ourselves in 10 or 20 years. And that brings us back to the discussion on Ukraine's NATO membership. There's no consensus on that in view of the July summit, but we cannot run away from this question, and we have to make sure that some progress in this regard is achieved, especially as while we will be having the NATO summit in July, it will be probably the time of the expected Russian offensive. And we have to make sure that any signals we send at this time are very well calculated on our side.
Thank you, Anna. So what I grasped from your intervention, we need more credible perspective for Ukraine in NATO. We need to credibly staff the operational plans agreed in Vilnius with credible forces and communicate it via high visibility exercises. And we need to seal the sanctions regime so that Russia does not benefit from these shadow fleets as regards oil, for instance, or the other or the back channels for trade, including dual-use technologies. Anybody on the recommendations part, what to do to win with Russia, to deter it from the escalation, to make it not reconstitute the way we discussed it could?
Okay, so I try to be very brief, just a few additional points to Anna has just said. First of all, we should define our strategy towards Russia. I mean, ours means the Western/NATO strategy towards it. then we also have to listen to the Russians very carefully and to prepare well for the threats coming from Russia, including cyber, hybrid, but also Soviet-style mass army. As NATO, are we prepared to tackle with the mass-style army? We have to also cooperate with our partners in the world, including also the Global South, which is also very important. And also we have to honestly answer the one question, if we want to protect every inch of NATO territory, are we ready to destroy the Russians on their territory before their troops cross our borders? Because it's also very, very important from our side, who will be responsible for such kind of the decision, what kind of politician, because the army will do this if they received such kind of order. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Anna. Christina, yes, please.
So I would say that, first of all, when I think about risk, before we talk about recommendation, I just want to drive one point home. I mean, the risk is intent plus capability. We're talking a lot about capability, and we were also talking a little bit about intent. I think that the problem we have, that in fact, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, I think that there's a new intent that they didn't necessarily have or wasn't as strong as it is now, which is revenge. I mean, if Russia frames it as a war against West, then their casualties are inflicted by the West. So that's one thing I would say, that, because the intent, in fact, to threaten NATO is, in my opinion, stronger than it used to be. Like, there's also, when we're talking about capability, that means that we have to be prepared for more, in a sense, because the risk is more acute. So that's one thing. Another thing is, in terms of very specific even recommendations, capability in this terms is not only their capability, it's our capability, because we're talking about correlation of forces. I mean, ultimately, it's about how they assess their probability of accomplishing what they want. And that probability comprises of our troops, their troops, and the perception on both sides. So, Anna was talking a lot about that perception. And I think that, but then when we're talking about, it's not only our arming ourselves, there's also this dimension of defensive and offensive capabilities. And I think that, we invest a lot in these big ticket items right now, because, there's a lag time. We need to be doing that. But we also have to actually, because Russia is thinking about mass, we have to also go back to basics. I mean, for a very long time, we hope that there's this rate of technical substitution between quantity and quality, between mass and our technological superiority that favors us, that we can have that substitution, that we don't necessarily need mass because our technology is superior. I think that this war shows that it actually might be more complicated. And so we might have to go back to basics, and the stuff that we talk a lot here about with some of my colleagues is strictly defensive capabilities, which is, for example, in a whole engineering suite, right? I mean, we can prepare our borders in a way that makes it incredibly difficult for Russia to cross. I mean, if we ask, what happened in Ukraine that they stopped moving forward, it was essentially obstacles. I mean, minefields, engineering obstacles, all that stuff. And I'm not saying necessarily that we have to deploy minefields right now on NATO border, but we should be thinking about these things very seriously. Also because this type of defensive capabilities, they are very useful also for signaling, in a sense that they very clearly signal that we have defensive purposes, that we don't intend to go on Moscow. We have no interest in that. But the only thing we want to do is to make sure that Russia doesn't invade NATO territory. So I would go really, and just one last point to drive this home is that there is this asymmetry. And I don't want to go to too much details, right? But when we're talking, for example, about anti-personnel mines, most of Western countries don't use them because they are signatories of Ottawa conventions. So, this is something we have to rethink, because we have to treat this very seriously, and not everything can be accomplished because of just because we have superior technology.
Thank you. Another very, very up to the point recommendation. Kestutis, very quickly, and then if anybody start thinking about questions, I will give the floor. Yes, there is one question there, but please, before that, Kestutis.
Very quickly, I think there are 5 imperatives for us to achieve success as NATO strategically. Number 1, cognitive superiority. We need to understand the Russian capability and intent better than they understand us. So get into their decision-making cycle and disrupt it, the whole kill chain. Cognitive superiority, resilience, civilian, but also military resilience. This is what we are learning really hard from Ukraine war. Supplies, reserves, reconstitution, all of this matters. This is a lost art for NATO. Number 3, command and control. We need a command and control that is fit for this future battle space, very fast-moving battle space with elements of attrition, but also elements of precision with unmanned systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Number 4, multi-domain integration. We have to master the art of multi-domain integration and multi-domain operations. And number 5, the art of escalation management. 10 years ago, deterrence was a dirty word in NATO corridors. We managed to get over it. Now deterrence is an accepted word. We now need to become comfortable with escalation management across domains and across regions. Otherwise, we will never be able to impose dilemmas and impose the risk of escalation on the Russians. We always seem to accept that the risk will be imposed on us, and then we will always argue that we need to de-escalate. No, we have to reverse that logic in a proactive way.
Thank you. That's a great point. There are 2 questions, but please make it questions. There's the lady there. Please go to the mic. We'll bundle them into 3. I have also an online question.
Patty Morrissey. I spent 20 years in the Pentagon and retired from DNI about a year and a half ago, and run a company now called Global Foresight Strategies. And I'm here because Lukesh invited me. I wanted to ask sort of a broader question of, do you all feel that Russia's full spectrum attack on Ukraine that includes the partners of Ukraine, that's worked really hard to undermine support for aid to Ukraine, has undermined via cyber attacks, has countered anti-corruption efforts? I have a long spiel on what full spectrum Russian warfare is. I am asking you, do you feel like we can do a better job countering Russia on other fronts than this discussion today, which has been very much focused on hard power, which is critical, right? But there is this broader strategic competition going on that Russia has been quite successful in undermining, I'll just say, the US support, political support for what would be obvious in the past to us. Of course, we would support Ukraine with whatever it takes. So just thoughts on that broader strategic fight.
Yeah, we'll take 3 questions. So one more from General Norbelt. I think I saw your hand. Yes.
Thank you very much. The questions about reconstitution, and you know, I think that everyone it's talking about now, it's pretty much serious. So we understand that they are on the war footage now. They are much more efficient, and in theory, it's very little that we can do with that. But on the other hand, if we analyze and try to identify some critical vulnerabilities on the Russia side and try to understand what we can do and how we can disrupt or influence that process, it gets us to the point that they are not self-sufficient in terms of, you know, production, in terms of, you know, providing high-end military capabilities, the precision strikes. They rely upon some external providers. So I think it's not only about sanctions. There are some, you know, other areas that we can influence that situation and disrupt the whole process. There are intermediaries, you know, partners in countries that are getting, let's say, chips and providing to Russians and let them reconstitute and keep up with operational tempo. So the question is whether you agree, or what shall we do in terms of, you know, pushing our diplomacy and some other channels to influence those internal actors? That's the first question. And the other one is about architecture, just quickly. it was, about Ukraine, how they should be incorporated and invited and playing, active role. And I think that there is lots of things in lots of areas that we have to work on our own in terms of, readjust and adapt to new security stance in Europe. Let's say the common market for natural resources that we are getting from Russia, they have driven the wedge, they split us apart. So I think we have to be smart and think ahead how to adjust ourselves to face a new era in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. One more question.
I'll keep it short. Colin Smith from RAND, and it really just builds on the general's question, actually more specific. He talked about the intermediary countries. The panel, as you talk Russian reconstruction, no one keeps talking about China and some of their other really key allies that are contributing stuff. Is, unless you kind of disrupt that, what is the panel's opinion on Russia's ability to continue to reconstruct themselves?
Thank you. And I'll take the final one. And it's thanks for asking this question, because one of our online participants asked precisely that, how to address the fact that there are international global allies of Russia which help sustain Russia, its operation in Ukraine via dual use, via providing Shahids like Iran, or allegedly providing dual use technologies like China. But please, sir.
Thank you. Bill Courtney with RAND. Polish leaders occasionally talk about a nuclear mission. They have in mind that Poland would participate in the F-35 dual capable aircraft activity, or some other kind of system like a nuclear armed cruise missile or JASM or something like that. Appreciate your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if we have room for one more question. No, if it's four, then there is one. Yeah, the very last one, please. And then we will go straight to the panel, and this will be already your final words. So can you go to the mic so that our online participants?
My name is Lisa Aronson. I'm at the National Defense University. We've spoken a lot about what the alliance needs to do to strengthen defense and deterrence. And having just been in Poland, I'm sort of mindful of the relative size of your economy, your defense spending, your own ambitious 15-year modernization program. How do you envision Poland's role in strengthening defense and resilience among the Bucharest 9 countries? What is Poland's contribution to that? Thanks. And how can the United States help facilitate you?
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, so if I can ask you to pick one or two questions at maximum and address them in like 2 minutes, each of you, starting the same order we started. So with you, Anna, going first.
Okay, so maybe I'll try to tackle the first question, what we can do in other domains. Probably I will go and jump into the cyber one, which is very close to my heart. I think that we can here do a lot. Just also to develop nowadays it's an active defense idea, but I think that every single member of NATO should do more, also to cooperate with each other, and maybe also to change a little bit our approach, that in this specific domain we shouldn't be just reactive, but also be to some extent proactive. I know that NATO is defense alliance, but still it's this operational field in which we don't have peacetime. We have crisis/wartime. So that's why probably also to think how we can create a plenty of challenges for our potential enemy. Thank you.
Thank you. Christina.
Let me maybe very quickly address the issue of China, Iran, and influencing Russia's ability to acquire this high-end capabilities. I think that there are two things to say about that. One is that I think this is just a very meticulous work that is ongoing, and probably we can leverage better some AI tools for that to find, because this is essentially just a cat and mouse game. You know, Russia has this very long tradition going back to Soviet Union. There's actually a great paper by CIA from like mid-80s that describes how Soviet Union was able to acquire technologies through shell companies and like this very elaborate scheme. So they still have that know-how. So this is essentially cat and mouse. This is work that is ongoing to find these intermediaries and disrupt those networks. But this is a very technical issue, I believe. And again, we can probably leverage some new instruments to detect that. So that's one thing. But honestly, more important, I would say that the problem is that ultimately, even if we do that, Russia will still have mass that is able to produce domestically. And, you know, again, to quote actually Russian expert, old tank is better than no tank. And so, you know, and they will have that capability, even if it's, you know, even if it's dumb munitions, they will be producing them. And this is, so regardless of this very meticulous work we're doing, we have to brace ourselves for confrontation with this mass, even if it's, you know, on much lower technological level than our capability.
Thank you, Christina. And Anna, final words from Russia, from Warsaw on Russia, of course, from Warsaw on Russia.
I will try to answer some of those questions, starting with the question from the general. On the need to look more comprehensively at Russian threat, that's actually something which we are advocating in NATO, to start comprehensive discussion and to adopt a containment strategy of Russia. And by the containment strategy, we need looking at all different strands of work, putting it all together and making, I would call it, a master plan for the long-term road. On the question of the nuclear sharing, I would say that some of the elements mentioned in the question sound reasonable, as Russia is declaring readiness to shift some of its nuclear forces to Belarus and build their dual-use capabilities. That means that actually the Russian nuclear forces are moving closer and closer to our borders. The nuclear threats keep repeating. And we do need in NATO a serious reflection on how to react accordingly. And I would not exclude any options here, but that's a discussion that needs to be held not in public. And on the question of resilience, the key question actually is to support the partners in the region, and Moldova is the key element in the puzzle. And there's quite a serious effort ongoing and a lot of discussions among partners what to do to support Moldova's resilience, which is at the also forefront of Russian hybrid warfare. And going to the question on China and military support that other countries are providing to Russia, there is a potential to do much more to stop, especially Iran and DPRK, or to try to restrict deliveries of weapons and ammunition. It's quite a serious support from the Russian side. China is also supporting a lot through dual-use deliveries. So I'm also quite sure much more could be done in this regard. What we, I think, lost at it's a reach out to the global south. We need to find proper arguments to convince our partners far away, but we need to invest also much more in disinformation efforts, and not in just countering disinformation, but also in propagating our message. So strategic messaging, a lesson needs to be done.
Thank you, Anna. And 1 minute, Kestutis.
Thanks, Martin. I'll quickly pick up on the two questions, reconstitution. I think it's a little bit of a flawed paradigm. Why? Because the Russians have a force in being that is more experienced, more capable now than it was 2 years ago. Yes, they are reconstituting manpower, refilling the stocks, etc. But Russia will continue to be a military threat this year, next year, 3 years, 5 years from now to NATO. doesn't matter how long it takes to restock their supplies or remobilize. So it's a bit of a flawed paradigm in my mind. Number two, strategic competition. We should not be in strategic competition in Russia. ISW counted NATO and Asia Pacific allies combined has 60 plus trillion GDP compared to 2 trillion GDP of Russia, 60 to 2. But if you add China, that becomes 20 trillion. And this is part of the crux of the matter. How do we have our Kissinger moment 2.0 where we are able to drive a wedge between Russia and China, because this is where Russia's ultimate success rides upon. How do we get, as our colleague from Warsaw said, how do we get into that strategic competition over the global south, our relationship with China, our relationship with India? And the final point, the cognitive environment. We have allowed Russians to be in our information environment and our cognitive space. The Russians are here and they are conducting vigorous attacks, brazen attacks on us, on our minds, even as we speak. We are controlled by their reflexive control. So how do we get that fight back to them? How do we enter their information space? We were not doing that. We are not in Russian information space. We are not bringing, again, our colleague mentioned, how do we bring our message, the truth, the reality to the Russian people and the Russian regime? We have not been even trying to do that. It's okay to give lethal equipment to Ukraine, but it's against our morals to try to influence the behavior and attitudes of Russian population. And that cognitive dissonance in our Western way of thinking, for me, it's still mind-boggling, but this is what we need to do if we want success.
Thank you, Kęstutis. Thank you all. Wow, that's been an extremely rich panel. I failed to keep time, but I feel exonerated because of the quality of the discussion. So without further ado, Barry, please go ahead and close us.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to really thank all of our excellent participants. I mean, I just thought both panels were really extremely insightful. I kind of wish we could have had an all-day conference, but maybe next time.
Next time.
Thanks also to our wonderful new partners at PISM. It's a real pleasure and an honor, Lukasz, to work with you and your colleagues. Thanks also to our great RAND team for this seamless event in all dimensions. Mark and Anka, Libby, Carmen, and Jason, and I'm sure I'm missing a few people. And just everyone, please stay tuned as this work continues to move forward. We need your engagement and ideas. As you can tell, these are tough problems, but these are top priority US and allied national security problems. And I think it's the right place for PISM and for RAND to be engaging robustly. So thanks, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. Really appreciate it.